Today we're looking at the beginning and end of the Roland analog Juno series. The Alpha, so to speak, and the Omega. Wait, Josh, this doesn't work. This is the Alpha Juno 2. Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications. This is our Alamo Sound Lab channel where we talk about all things music technology related. And today we're looking at the Juno-60 and the Alpha Juno 2, which are in a way the beginning and end points to the analog Alpha or the analog Juno series from Roland. And specifically, we're looking at the Alpha Juno 2 and asking, why is it so much less expensive in the vintage market than the Juno-60? I picked up this Alpha Juno 2, I think, for a couple $100, like $400. A Juno-60 is trending in the $2,000 to $3,500 price range right now, currently in the vintage used market. And so you have to wonder, what's so different between the Juno-60 and the Alpha Juno 2? Is that price differential valid? What is the kind of history and story of the Juno analog series? Is there something inherently better about the earlier Juno-60 and 6 compared to the latter Alpha Juno 2 and Juno 1? And today we're going to talk about that a little bit and ultimately listen to them side by side and so you get a sense of how they differ and how they're alike sonically. So the Roland Juno series was Roland's kind of budget, mid-range analog polysynth. And the Juno-60 was technically the very first, and it's almost identical to the Juno-60, except the Juno-60 had patch memory, so you could store patches, and the Juno-6 did not. So I think there might be one other difference. I think the DCB might not be present on all the Juno-6s, which was their proprietary kind of connector between Roland instruments, pre-MIDI. So the Juno-60 is beloved. It's probably currently the most loved of the entire Juno line, and it comes from the early 80s when Roland was still kind of in the mode of putting very high quality parts and kind of making these mega analog synths. It's when analog was still in vogue. It's before things started to rapidly go down the digital path after the release of the DX7, and where analog went out of vogue, and we saw the disappearance of major manufacturers like Sequential, Moog, and Oberheim. Many of the classic analog manufacturers from the late 70s went out of business during this time. And Roland managed to stay in business, but they pivoted and migrated into making digital synthesizers. And the Juno series kind of follows that evolutionary path where they became progressively more like a digital synthesizer and took on componentry and cost-saving measures that were part of the trends at the time. It also represents the pursuit of realism that was present in 80s kind of synth design. There was a desire to get away from these kind of synthesized tones that didn't sound like real instruments and move towards actual kind of sounds that sounded very close to actual pianos or marimbas or kind of drum sounds. There was a desire to get realistic in your tones, and that really began with the DX7 and FM synthesis. So from the Juno-60 to the Alpha Juno 2, you can see many steps that Roland took on their way towards that path, and ultimately with the D50, which was their big digital synth that came out in the mid-80s, that some of the technology found in these Junos, the Juno, Alpha Juno 2, and I should say the JX8 and the JX10 would show up later in the D50. So that's really conceptually the difference between the Juno-60 and the Alpha Juno 2. It's interesting, there's two other DCO analog synths that Roland, there's three actually, the GX3, the JX8, and the JX10, that also are kind of parallel to the Juno series in that they weren't as expensive as their Jupiter kind of flagship synths, but they were up there. They were more expensive than the Junos, and also did more things with cross modulation and kind of an analog realistic instrument tone. And so you got, they had 2 oscillators as opposed to the 1 oscillator found in the Juno series. And they had a bunch of patches that sounded more like, sounded more realistic than classic kind of analog tone synthesis. So the Alpha Juno 2 is interesting to me because it is actually more, to me, a hybrid of the Junos and the JX series. That's, to me, the easiest way to understand it. The Alpha Juno 2 was kind of, has some weird things in it, like the wave, it has a pulse wave and a saw wave in its oscillator, but it has, I think, and in the sub-oscillators, well, it has something like 14 different waveform variations, and the pulse has 3 different variations, and the saw has 5, and the sub has 5, and so you get some really complex kind of harmonic richness in just the basic single oscillator. You get, and by layering the pulse and the saw and the sub, you can get some really interesting tones, and they somehow manage to get FM-like tones, and in some of the pre-patches, as you'll hear, there's some really interesting kind of drum sounds and kind of piano and marimba sounds, and there's also the envelope is not just a basic ADSR, it also has a couple other points in it where you can make a more complex envelope. I think it has 7 different kind of parameters that you can modify, whereas the Juno-60 and the 106 only had 4 different ones. And so you can get really interesting different tones out of this. It sounds, to me, when I listen to it, it sounds a lot like a JX8 or a JX10, but with, you know, less polyphony than the JX10, and also kind of, it's a little less precise. There's not 2 envelopes, and so it's more confined, but it does have a lot of the characteristics of those instruments. And it came with a, it didn't come with it, you could purchase an optional controller with it that was like the JX8 and the JX10, the PG800. It had its own controller that you could purchase to kind of give you all the knobs that like you found on the Juno-60, where all the parameters were out on the front. Here, the only way to access them without that controller was to use the dial wheel, which is actually easier to use than the JX8 or the JX3P or JX10, because it has the LED has it has the names of the parameter you're modifying and the values, where I don't think any of the JX10 did, but the 8 and the 3 do not have that. So it's actually not that hard to modify. It's just a little tedious, but it does have a controller that gives you that kind of one-to-one knob functionality that you get in the 60 and the 106. So another difference between these two is the envelope is software envelope. It's a hardware envelope in the 60, so you saw that kind of move towards less hardware-based, analog, expensive componentry to more software-based. It doesn't have the knobs like the one-to-one knobs without buying the extension, which again is a cost-saving feature. It doesn't have an arpeggiator. It does have glide, which is nice, but the arpeggiator in the Juno-60 is really a fun kind of classic part about it. It does have MIDI, which is nice, built in, and it's got a decent MIDI implementation. It also has some interesting modulation capabilities that aren't found in the original Juno-60, so you can do some interesting things there. A couple other little differences is the chorus. The choruses are different in the Alpha Juno and the Juno-60. They're both analog. The Alpha Juno 2 chorus can be modified, the levels that are present, and so that it's a little bit more flexible than the Juno-60. Although many people still prefer the Juno-60 chorus. I like the Alpha Juno 2 chorus. It's pretty good, but it is a different chorus. And then there's also a chord memory mode in the Alpha Juno 2, which is not present in the Juno-60. Other than that, there's not a whole lot more that's different about them. It is a lot smaller. It's more compact. It actually feels to me hardier than the Juno 106, which is strange. The Juno 106 always, to me, feels a little kind of more prone to breaking. The Alpha Juno 2 doesn't feel that way. So it's still kind of definitely 80s Roland, which they were trying to save money on construction, but it feels pretty hardy. Small, not too heavy, a lot smaller than the Juno-60. But let's take a listen, and you can kind of hear how these are similar and how they're different. And really what I want to focus on the Alpha Juno 2 when I'm playing it is the kind of FM-y tones or the JX-y tones that you can find in here, because I think that's where it shines. It was used in a lot of like 90s dance music. The Juno-60, again, is much more synth pop, it's got that vintage feel and kind of etherealness and magic and presence, and a little grittier. Alpha Juno 2 is more like a JX in that it's more subdued. It sounds, for lack of a better word, a little digitally. It doesn't have the analog is almost analog component. It does sound analog to me, but it's almost designed to hide that as much as possible. But I still think it's unique. I think it's definitely underrated. It's definitely not a lame duck. It's very powerful. There's a lot of people that swear by it, and it's incredibly affordable. So let's take a listen, and you can kind of decide for yourself. So I hope that gave you a sense of how these are alike and different. Again, the Alpha Juno 2 to me is not a lame duck. It's kind of a hidden gem. You can still pick it up really affordably. It's probably one of the least expensive analog Roland Juno vintage synths that you can find on the market today. And as you can hear, it's pretty powerful. It's got some really cool features about it, and I think it does the Juno name justice. I think it's a little bit of misjustice that it's been forgotten about as much as it has. And the Juno-60, as you can hear, is always magical and so much fun to play with, but they're insanely priced now, so you have to have a lot of extra cash just sitting around to go pick one up. Or maybe you'll find one in a dumpster somewhere, who knows. If you have any other thoughts about these specific one, leave the comments below. And if we left any facts out or there's little things that would be of interest, please leave them below as well. If you want to talk to us more, you can find us online at almamusic.com, and you can chat us up there, give us a call, whatever. And if you didn't, hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications. Thank you for watching today.